Подрыв плотины.
At the direction of Kiev, a large-scale discharge of water was carried out at the DeBar hydroelectric station, located upstream.
That was the Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev, referring to the Kakhovka dam collapse.
And then there was another strike on the Kakhovka dam, exacerbating the consequences of the flood. Blowing up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam is yet another planned terrorist attack by the Kiev regime aimed at harming civilians and destroying infrastructure. The US cannot say who's responsible for the blast. At the same time, it is known that the US, Britain and their NATO partners are coordinating the activities of the Ukrainian army. Accordingly, they gave their consent to the attack and should be held accountable for this cynical act.
The collapse has resulted in an ecological disaster with massive flooding. Located in Russia's Kherson region on the Dnieper River, the Kakhovka Dam was breached Tuesday. It resulted in the flooding of huge swaths of land and massive evacuation efforts. Moscow and Kiev have since traded accusations over who caused the breach. Kiev denied responsibility. However, in an interview with the Washington Post last December, General Andrei Kovalchuk, then commander of Ukrainian troops in the Kherson region, said that Kiev had conducted a test strike with the U.S.-supplied HIMARS launchers on one of the floodgates at the dam. And while numerous Ukrainian officials have flatly denied that their promised spring offensive has begun, the New York Times reported Monday, citing U.S. sources, that Ukraine had likely started its offensive, saying that it was still focused on probing Russian defenses and that the main thrust would become evident soon. To sort through all of this, we go to Moscow to speak with military analyst Mark Sleboda. We spoke with him via Skype on Thursday. Mark, good to speak with you, of course. Could you describe exactly what happened and then, give us some details about what's being done, whatever information you have, because we have really very little here.
Don, okay, so the Kiev regime offensive began several weeks ago. An offensive is not just one big blitzkrieg event, right? It takes lots of preparatory work. It can occur in multiple areas, multiple axes, and it could involve many different things. All told, the Kiev regime's offensive began 3 weeks ago. This Sunday, I saw probably the most active part of it to date. There were attacks on an area of the border between the Zaporozhye region and southern Donetsk, known as the Vremivka salient. Only a few small villages of a few small houses there, but it's the geography that matters and the relative paucity of the Russian defensive lines there. A lot of people were saying that was the big offensive push, and I was saying, no, it's going to come later, further west. Anyway, under days of assault, Russian forces have held there. Briefly, they were pushed back from several forward position settlements, but managed to retake them overnight, and the Kiev regime hasn't been able to take and hold anything. Then yesterday, what I would describe as the big offensive push kicked off. And the Washington Post is right now reporting that the Kiev regime is finally admitting that the big offensive active phase has kicked off. And that is to the west, in the center of Zaporozhye, a small city by the name of Orehova. And the Kiev regime has been throwing so far several thousand troops, hundreds of armored vehicles, including at least dozens of tanks and so forth, repeatedly for the last 12 or 15 hours in at least 5 waves against echelon Russian defensive lines there, and haven't managed to penetrate one of them in any significant way thus far that I have seen. Heavy casualties. The backdrop to these big military developments going on is the destruction of the Kakhovka Reservoir Dam, which is just slightly to the west of where all the fighting is. This is where the Dnieper River begins emptying out. There is a series of dams there. The Kakhovka Reservoir Dam is the last big one before the Black Sea. The Kakhovka Reservoir, that is also where the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and the nearby town of Energodar is. That's where it gets its cooling water from the reservoir. That reservoir also is what provides the water for the canal network that provides irrigation for all of South Ukraine, now Russian-controlled, and Crimea as well. It provides the water input to the Crimean Canal. So the destruction of this dam, almost certainly by the Kiev regime, accomplished several things. First, it wiped out all of Russia's defensive positions and fortifications and minefields closest to the river. This is because the terrain is very different on the two sides of the river. On the Kiev regime-controlled right bank is much higher up terrain-wise, elevation, than the lower Russian side. So much of the flooding damage occurs on the Russian side, as well, of course, as cutting off the water to the Crimea, to South Ukraine, and to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So that is, the significant motivation for that, right? Wipe out Russian defenses, lower the water level in the Kakhovka Reservoir that will, in a few days, enable amphibious attacks, and punish the people of South Ukraine and the Crimea, again, collectively for choosing wrong. And the Kiev regime actually opened up the sluice gates on the next dam up the river at Dnieper, the Dnieper River Dam, in order to maximize the damaging that the flooding caused. And we have to remember that in December, the Washington Post reported that the Kiev regime previously targeted this dam with the U.S.-provided HIMARS launchers as a test run for their plan to blow up the dam. They admitted that in December. They're not talking about it now. Check it yourself. And last April, the New York Times talked about how the Kiev regime had already destroyed several of their other dams around Kiev, whatever the environmental and damage to the civilian towns, in order to slow down Russian forces. So they have a track record of destroying dams. They have a track record of destroying this dams. They've got every motivation for doing so. So who did it? Russia, of course. I mean, Russia blew up their own pipeline. They blew up their own dam. They blew up their own power station. They attacked their own Kremlin. They blew up their own bridge. Everything. The Kiev regime hasn't done anything. That's the ridiculous propaganda that you are expected to buy.
I'm wondering, by the way, why is it that we have to send over 150 or now it's going to be almost $200 billion to Kiev for this war when the Russians, of course, are making war on themselves? I mean, they could just sit back and watch.
It must be a genetic trend. Russians just continually kill themselves.
Yes.
They've been doing it for 9 years in East Ukraine, according to the Kiev regime.
Yeah. So just quickly, because we're almost out of time, the intelligence you're talking about something. This is like a major hit with multiple sets of implications, all favorable to Ukraine, but of course they haven't been able to capitalize on it because of some larger contextual issues. But this requires some deep intelligence, like the location of the Russian defenses, all these different things. Is this something that Kiev is capable of, or?
Oh no! I mean, U.S. military satellites are constantly focusing on this area, as they are in Belgorod, where the shelling is continuing. U.S. reconnaissance flights are constantly flying U.S. and other NATO in the Black Sea, providing location of Russian positions with reconnaissance spy planes and drones and the like, and this is still going on. And a big part of this, of both the offensive and the reason for the dam, is you're going to see a renewed attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant at Energodar, probably a joint amphibious once the water levels recede and the level of the Kakhovka reservoir will then be lower, a joint amphibious and a land attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, probably within a week.
Which would be, of course, catastrophic in the event.
Yes.
For all of Europe. Mark, thank you so much for this information, and we'll speak with you again next week.
Thanks for having me.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.